On April 10, 1834, a fire broke out in a mansion in the Old French Quarter of New Orleans. When the neighborhood poured out to offer help, they noticed something odd. The woman of the house was trying to save her jewels and furs, without the aid of her slaves. When asked where her servants were, she told everyone to mind their own business. Some said this was mysterious enough. Others said they heard faint moans and screams from the attic. Either way, a small brigade took it upon itself to bust into the house and find the woman's slaves. Yet when they opened the door to the attic, they stopped dead in their tracks, some vomiting from the stench. What the interlopers found would not only shock the city of New Orleans, but would send waves of horror across the entire world that can still be felt today. This is the shocking story of Marie Delphine LaLaurie. Born in 1787, in then Spanish-ruled New Orleans as Marie Delphine McCarty, most of LaLaurie's life passed without any real indication of cruelty or evil. Despite rumors that slaves killed her parents, the mistress actually lived a fairly normal and privileged life. She was a major part of New Orleans high society, and beloved as a kind, gentle, and courteous figure. Revisionists even point out that, on at least 2 occasions, she had emancipated slaves. Some try to explain LaLaurie's descent into depravity by way of her third husband, Louis LaLaurie, who was not related to her before their marriage. Soon after their marriage began, stories of her abuse against her slaves started to emerge. Residents filed complaints, leading to investigations for cruelty to slaves. New Orleans had unique laws protecting chattel servants, more than in other parts of the Deep South, in 1828, 1829, and 1832. Some say, she began beating her daughters when they tried to feed them, although she put on a kind public face. Those inclined to absolve LaLaurie take this line of logic, that the mistress was driven to insanity and violence by Louis, to its extreme. They argue that Louis, who some suspect was experimenting with Haitian voodoo potions to create more docile servants, turned away help from the fire, as he was the one mutilating the LaLaurie slaves in cruel half-medical experiments. Yet, Louis wasn't the only force that would have introduced the mistress to violence. Many suspect that LaLaurie was influenced by the 1771 murder of her uncle by slaves. The violence of the 1791 to 1804 Haitian slave revolt, independence movement, and the direct experience of a slave uprising in New Orleans in 1811. The terror of these events and the growing consensus amongst local slave owners to exercise increasing violence and oppression, often demonstrated in public and gruesome ways, to prevent recurrences in the aftermath, likely had a strong impact on LaLaurie, who would have been exposed to chaos and anti-slave bloodshed regularly. The plantation owners, of which LaLaurie was one, were living in terror, explains Daniel Rasmussen, the author of American Uprising, A History of the 1811 Slave Rebellion. They were terrified by Haiti. They had read the newspaper reports. Once a week or so there's some story about rapes, beheadings, brutality against whites in Haiti. And they think if they don't crack down and keep their slaves under control, what happened in Haiti will happen in New Orleans. The forms of punishment were quite extreme. The 1811 revolt saw over 100 slaves beheaded. Their heads were put on poles, stretching for 40 miles from the center of New Orleans, out into the countryside. You'd see slaves' corpses from the rebellion, dangling from the city gates. This growing sense of panic and unease probably explains why none of the investigators called in to check on LaLaurie's cruelty, or ever charged her with anything, until 1833, that is. That year, the mistress apparently grew enraged with a 12-year-old slave girl, Leah, who tugged at a snag, while brushing the mistress's hair. She chased the young girl around with a whip, and the tween chose to jump off the roof, rather than face a thrashing. Witnesses saw LaLaurie burying the girl's mangled corpse, so they were forced to fine her $300 and make her sell her 9 slaves. But they looked the other way, as they did in most slave cruelty cases, when LaLaurie had her family members buy back her slaves, transfer them to her, and compensated them for their expenses. For all the anti-cruelty laws, a good degree of violence was tolerated. So, nobody would have recorded exactly what was going on in the LaLaurie household in the years before the fire, because it all probably just seemed like your standard, post-1811 slave punishments. Then, the LaLaurie mansion fire broke out in 1834. That episode is actually well documented in the newspapers of the day. Folks did get irate at LaLaurie for not opening her attic to free her slaves, and what they found did shock them. Slaves were found chained, scarred, and starving. One paper noted that 7 were suspended by their necks and badly mutilated, while another mentioned a man with a hole in his head filled with maggots. They had bloody welts, were living on gruel, and wore iron collars with inward-facing spikes, which seems like a tableau pulled from an archetypal, medieval torture chamber. Yet, according to Rasmussen, these were fairly typical forms of restraint on the plantations outside of New Orleans, where rural landholders feared that their slaves would grab their field machetes at night and come for them in their sleep. So, they exercised extreme brutality regularly. They would tie your hands to 4 stakes, then whip you with a cat-o'-nine-tails. And that would leave you bleeding and barely able to move, says Rasmussen. They also had iron masks to put around your head so you couldn't eat. And they had collars with spikes facing inwards, so the slaves couldn't sleep without getting spikes stuck in their necks. Those were common forms of punishment in Louisiana during this period. They believed that without the threat of tremendous violence, slaves wouldn't stay slaves. LaLaurie became famous for the depraved brutalization of her slaves. Legend has it that a 70-year-old slave cook, who had been chained to the stove by LaLaurie, yet was slowly starving to death, started the fire. But that was far from her most extreme torture. A brief catalogue of the ever-changing list of horrors people claim the would-be rescuers found in her attic include heaps of corpses, organs, and limbs. Slaves, pinned to tables or cramped in small cages. Live bodies, with their eyes gouged, fingernails torn out, ears hanging by shreds of skin, or their mouths filled with animal shit and sewn shut. People flayed of skin, with festering wounds. Many accounts claim they found one woman, whose skin had been peeled off, in spirals to make her look like a caterpillar. Another, with her bones broken, and reset so that she looked like a crab, and one more, whose intestines had been torn out and knotted around the waist. Many of these victims, up to 100, were supposedly still alive, putrid and starving. Normal or not, a mob of nearly 4,000 people still felt that this violence was egregious enough to ransack LaLaurie's house on the spot, looting and pillaging, in disgusted rage as the fire burned. Rasmussen suspects that by this time, over 20 years removed from the violence LaLaurie had grown up with, and secure inside the safety of a now established and well-controlled New Orleans, people had started to lose their fear of slaves, distancing themselves from the harsh punishments of the countryside, and coming closer to the genteel image of protective and soft slavery, promoted in things like the local legal code, under which LaLaurie had been investigated. Whatever the source of their shock, they seemed hell-bent on punishing LaLaurie for her overzealous application of an already extreme form of punishment. Yet in the fracas, she escaped with her slave driver, Bastien, to the docks, where she fled to Paris. Some believe that she died there in 1842 or 1849, and was disinterred and moved to a cemetery in New Orleans in 1851. Others believe she faked her death in Paris so that she could secretly return to Louisiana and keep on carrying out her cruel life secretly. Others believe she never really left. It's all a mystery. For almost 200 years, there have been reports of paranormal activity coming from this house. It shouldn't surprise many that many hauntings are attributed to the slaves that Madame LaLaurie kept on the property. There is a room in the LaLaurie mansion where slaves were often kept, and reports of moaning coming from that room, are common. Phantom footsteps echo through the house with regularity. Many people, who have stood near the house, have reported feeling as if they were taken over by negative energy. The LaLaurie Mansion was for a very brief time also a school for all girls, during the mid to late 19th century. Within a short amount of time, reports of physical assaults came to light. We know that young girls would approach their teachers, tears streaking down their faces, with their sleeves rolled up. The exposed flesh of their forearms were scratched and bruised. "Who did this to you?" the teachers would demand. The answer was always one and the same. That woman. But these girls were young enough to be probably not aware of Madame Delphine and the devastating tragedy some decades earlier. One must wonder if the young girls were playing pranks on each other, or if their claims that some phantom woman had scarred them was true. Facts are spun into tales of brutality and torture, until the truth is a muddled pool that can never be sorted. The more research one does, the more confusing the whole story becomes. When actor Nicolas Cage purchased the building in 2009, he lost it soon after, because of bankruptcy. His career tanked not long after that, and New Orleanians whispered that it must be the curse of the LaLaurie Mansion, which caused the downward spiral. Thank you all for watching the first episode of my new series. The love and support I've been shown is truly amazing. In return, I will be giving away one free shirt once the channel reaches 500 subscribers. To be entered into this drawing, please subscribe and leave a comment on any video of mine. The winner will be picked in 2 weeks from today. And never forget, all things go bump in the night on the witching hour.